You're watching Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum's latest show, committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist, and our special guest this week, James Orr, Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Cambridge and the UK Chair of the Edmund Burke Foundation. Now, James, as well as being a man of thought, you're also a man of action of sorts. You're involved in all sorts of institutions and initiatives to restore the fortunes of genuine conservatism in this country. Despite the doom and gloom of the last 2 or 3 years or so, do you remain an optimistic fellow?
Long term, I'm an optimist. Things are no doubt dark at the moment, and I don't go in for talk of a sort of civilizational twilight, but there is a lot of twilight talk in the air at the moment. But dawn comes after dusk, and I think we often overrate the place of the contingent in human history, and history turns on a dime. And one of the things that, for all of our mastery of technology and science and so on and so forth, we are terrible prognosticators. We are terrible at anticipating the future, and we often rely too much on history as a guide to what's going to happen. History does not repeat itself. It sometimes rhymes, but we often don't predict the rhymes very well. We can only see the rhymes really in retrospect. I sometimes use the example of, imagine being at a dinner party in East Berlin in January 1989, or a spam party, or whatever it is you ate over dinner in January
well, indeed, yes.
in East Berlin in 1989, and imagine somebody had turned to you and said, in 10 months' time, all this will be over. Now, I think the reaction would have been, "You're certifiable. Do you not understand? Shut up. We're being listened to.
Yes.
Walls have ears. Stasi's got your number." I mean, look, maybe that's an exaggeration. The rumblings were clear in '89. We'd seen lots of sort of tectonic shifts in Poland, the Solidarity movement, and things were beginning to crack, Glasnost, Perestroika, and so on. But I think it's very easy for the pessimists to overestimate the fixity of the course of history, and so we need to be open to radical, rapid change. And notice, I use that example deliberately because what was the case? What was the situation in early 1989 in Eastern Europe? Well, a decrepit, decadent empire of sorts, propped up by an ideology that was brittle, fragile, nobody really believed in. And therefore, I think the conditions were right for the end to, when the cracks really did start to appear, the end comes much, much faster than you think. This is often the case with groupthink. It's the so-called spiral of silence effect. Once, groupthink, once the costs of a shift, once the incentive structures shift just a little bit, once you've got enough little boys in the crowd ready to scream that the emperor's got no clothes, suddenly, precisely because of the extent of the groupthink, the turnaround can happen very, very fast, just because the number of true believers is actually
small.
Though we just don't really reckon with it.
Yeah, you get a preference cascade.
Exactly.
I think, I don't know, maybe Berlin in 1929 would be a more apt comparison to where we are now, because, we can talk about there being a brittle ideology, but I think if you look at the actual kind of ruling class of Britain, they've basically completely divorced themselves from the actual people who voted them in. There's it's quite evident that there is a two-tiered system with no real link left behind it. And I think, as in 1929, the Weimar era, you get these kind of dinner parties that spiral out into chaos, and meanwhile you don't understand what's kind of fermenting in the streets, and people are ready to start storming into banks and throwing notes into the air. Now, we're not at the point where the currency has become completely devalued, but I think our trust in the people that are running this country and running most of the other Western countries as well has almost completely dissipated. Nobody's really pretending to have any faith in it anymore. So one of the things that Harrison pointed out is that you're kind of a unique figure, I would say, actually, in the UK, because you've been building actual kind of institutions and counter little enclaves to kind of weather the storm. And I think that exists in America. I think we saw that a lot at the American NatCon in Miami a little over a year ago. We saw less of it at the UK London NatCon. What advice would you give to people who are looking to do something similar in perhaps their own lives or professionally, for people like yourself who have the clout and the ability to do so? What are they not getting that you've tapped into?
Well, look, it's kind of you to say so. I mean, there's no magic formula, and I never set out deliberately to be involved in this sort of pieces, developing infrastructure, and I sort of stumbled into it, really. I mean, I was a lawyer in a former life, and I stumbled into, I left law for academia, hoping to retreat to the quiet life among books.
You've done a terrible job of that.
Dusty books, writing dusty books that nobody was ever going to read, quietly, happily in my ivory tower for the rest of my life. That was my dream. And but you can ignore you may not care what the dialectic thinks about you, comrade, but you may not care about the dialectic, but the dialectic cares about you. This is the old Trotsky line. And I realised that there was no real hiding place. That began, I suppose, 10 years ago on campus. So it started, there were all these canaries starting to sing on campus. In fact, I noticed this 15 years ago. I mean, I'm a Christian, so I was aware of evangelical Christian unions beginning to get it in the neck, bank accounts frozen, banned from meeting on campus as early as 2007, 15 years ago. And I've been aware of it for a long time. So I suppose I've taken an interest in it. And I suppose within the university, you do have a lot more control over your own time. You don't really have people telling you what to do. And so you can develop a kind of career in intellectual entrepreneurship. And I suppose that's how things have evolved, and I've been very lucky in the people I've met and the opportunities that have opened up, and a lot of what I do simply I would not be able to do on my own. There's no doubt about that at all. But there are different sort of modes of counter-revolutionary engagement, you might say, that the organising horizon of what I do. There's think of three modes in particular. I mean, there's the persuasion mode, the provocation mode, and the power mode. So the persuasion mode is the sort of fairly standard mode that, normally mode that we'd be used to, of, writing articles, essays, engaging in podcasts, hosting distinguished speakers at universities to sort of give a slightly heterodox line on a particular topic. And that has its place, and I engage in that as much as I can. Involved in the scrutin lectures, for example, at Oxford, that have been running for 3 years very successfully now, filling the Sheldonian basically to capacity. With this year we had Douglas Murray, Kevin Spacey doing a little tour. At the end we had Sandy Stoddart, Lionel Shriver, Peter Thiel. That's been very, very important. That sort of persuasion mode is sort of strength in numbers, and it gives a lot of right embedded in the heart of Oxford. There's provocation mode, and I think that is one that I've been trying to work through. I mean, not to be deliberately provocative, but there is a place within, where you've got a degenerating intellectual culture dominated by groupthink, then you've got to think of ways in which you can, as it were, prick the bubble. Not, as I said, not kind of deliberately, not being too aggressive about it, but if you become aware of issues that are just sort of third rail, fourth rail issues that need to be addressed, then you've got to sort of start to give them oxygen. So that's something I'm trying to work on a little bit more. We had the Peterson affair at Cambridge 3 or 4 years ago. That was a sort of quite a radicalising moment for me. That was getting him back to Cambridge was provocative, and
that was last year, wasn't it?
This was end of 21, I think it was. End of 21. He was cancelled in 2019.
And then he did a speech at Gonville and Keys, didn't he?
And then we arranged that event at Gonville and Keys, and then a big university lecture the following day. Yes, and then finally there's power, and this is something which I know you've been discussing a lot on the podcast. It's a big matter for debate in America, and it should be increasingly here, ought to be. That is to say, we've got to be more comfortable, as Eric Kaufman, I think, mentioned on your podcast just a few weeks ago. We've got to be more comfortable when we've got power, actually exercising it. Yes. And that means building infrastructure, dismantling existing infrastructure, and building new infrastructure, and using Parliament and and legislation, clever lawfare to achieve that. So, to answer Evan's question, those are the sort of three modes of engagement. I don't really have a particular preference for any of the three, and one should be open to all three of those. At the institutional level, I mean, I think I might have, I've said this before to a number of people. I sometimes think of myself in, the 1520s, where you've got sort of three strands of the Reformation opening up. You've got the sort of early Lutheran strand, Universitas Societas Semper Reformanda, right? We can fix this. We can reform from within. We've got this institution's 800 years old. It's 2,000 years old. We mustn't abandon it. The sort of institutionalists, and then the kind of the Calvinists, only like, no,
burn it down.
It's over. Burn it down. Off we go. Salt the earth. Let's go off and build Geneva. So there's sort of parallel institutions we've got to build this stuff. There's a third group which I would actually put you guys in, which are the sort of the digital Anabaptists.
Okay.
So those who say we're fed up with institutions. Institutions are the problem. Institutions are too easily captured. Institutions can't cope with disagreement and schism. All of conquest laws apply, etc., etc. Let's just do something. Networks have all kinds of advantages laid out very nicely in Neil Ferguson's brilliant The Square and the Tower, if you're familiar with that, 2017. It has all, there are disadvantages to networks, but there are enormous advantages to networks too. I've found increasingly in the last 3 or 4 years, they're much more nimble, they're much more adaptive. They can handle disagreement better. You simply break off the nodes or rearrange the nodes. They grow geometrically rather than arithmetically. They're much easier to fund, much cheaper. You just need a few hubs here and there, important figures who are sort of relatively solid and permanent. Maybe the odd sort of anchoring institution, but that one that can operate independently. That doesn't is where the link is purely contingent. So those are the sort of, in terms of infrastructure, I think those are the three models. And I don't think it's we've got in a sort of civilizational fight, we've got to try all of them. And so I have a sort of foot
in each one.
In each one. I'm fortunate to have a position at the University of Cambridge, a wonderful university, and a university whose intellectual culture is way, way better than almost every single US university. That yes, conservatives are in a tiny, tiny minority, but generally, I don't feel that I'm constrained in what I can say. I don't, there are always tantrums at the level of students writing hit pieces in the sort of local university newspapers and having Twitter storms and all that sort of thing, but. The university itself has never told me that I can't say what I want to say. It's never forced me into a sort of Maoist mea culpa, and so I think actually things are pretty healthy. I think one of the ironies is that it's often the case that in this current sort of cultural moment, it's the institutions that most often get into the headlines in cancel culture and other matters that are oddly the healthiest. So take my faculty, the Faculty of Divinity. A colleague got invited Jordan Peterson along, and actually the application, I think, was basically approved. He was offered the visiting fellowship because divinity faculties tend to be a little bit more open and a little bit less easy. It's less easy for intellectual cultures like that to disappear down the rabbit hole because they're non-negotiably anchored in particular normative, scriptural, intellectual traditions. But of course, the headlines were divinity faculty is sort of this is the kind of the eye of the storm. This is the heart of the rock at Cambridge
because the spotlight gets shone on it.
When in fact, the idea that somebody like Pearson would have been offered a visiting fellowship at the English faculty or the sociology is just of course. The invite would not have landed on the doormat. So that's to answer your question, Evan. That's how I've sort of stumbled into a lot of this by accident, and trying different things that work and remaining happily within the University of Cambridge and. Doing what I can to provide some balance and a refuge to undergraduates and graduates and colleagues who want to have that kind of a sort of intellectual space where oxygen is given to issues that ought to be discussed but aren't.
It does seem to me as well, though, James, that because you say that we are at a civilizational moment, I think there'll be very few of our few people among our audience who won't agree with that. Is there a risk at moments like this that we become too obsessed with being heterodox, or too obsessed? Because it's interesting that you call us digital Anabaptists. Like one of my favourite 19th century political philosophers was the Spanish chap Juan Donoso Cortés,
yeah.
who's
I'm a big fan.
Good. Okay,
Yeah.
well, that's encouraging. Arguably, his central critique of liberalism was that it does just valorize what he called a discussing class, una clase discutidora.
Yeah.
And by doing so, it loses sight of the ability to get things done. If our only value, if our only positive value as a movement is a reflexive open-mindedness to all possible positive values, then to what extent are we immobilizing ourselves and making us almost sealing our fate at the hands of people who are much more partial, much more passionate, and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. I mean, a couple of thoughts. First, yes, you're right. I mean, if I've understood you correctly, there is a massive opportunity cost incurred in getting sucked into the woke, anti-woke dialectic and forgetting the civilizational inheritance that we ought to be defending by celebrating, not just sort of reactively
fighting barbarians.
Fighting, exactly. And that's crucial, and that's why, we're, Scruton lectures in Oxford, or institutions like Ralston College, which I'm honoured to be involved with in Savannah in Georgia. That's a parallel institution. If you like, it's a Geneva, but it's not. But it's a Geneva that is not, as it were, breaking out with a sort of new ideological outlook, but is recovering and retrieving the classical canon and classical pedagogy, and is not getting too sucked into the political side of things. Is simply, as it were, celebrating the fruits of the Hebraic and Hellenic and Christian civilizations, and that in itself, by the way, is a politically provocative act.
Sure, it gives people an ideal to strive towards.
That's right, exactly. And so, I mean, I think that's a very important. That's an important strand. In fact, I mean, we had Peter Thiel in Oxford just a couple of weeks ago, and he gave a brilliant lecture on the diversity myth. A little book he wrote.
It's a great book.
In the early 90s, where he saw a lot of this coming. And his argument in the lecture was that, was the opportunity cost worry? One way of explaining the sort of cultural wars is in terms of a kind of Nietzschean terms of ressentiment, a kind of, sort of maybe politics of envy.
I think it's all
the economically dispossessed and marginalized. But another way, Peter's way of thinking about it is in terms of divertissement. That diversity is a divertissement. It's a diversion. It's a diversion. It's almost a conscious diversionary strategy to drug us and anaesthetize us, really, in the way that Marx thought the function of religion was to sort of distract us from.
Do you agree with his thesis that a lot of this is just cope from low economic growth and low productivity, low innovation?
Well, no, and I don't know if he actually says that there's a causal connection there, that it's a sort of
congruence of interest.
Yeah, and I actually think, and I know there's disagreement on the right about this. I mean, I tend to, as on most things, I tend to side with Eric Kaufmann, who thinks, who's crunched the data here and really just doesn't think there is a tight causal link between, say, lower access to home ownership, lower home ownership, and weaker participation in the market among the Zoomers, and the kind of ideological frenzies that they're getting caught up in. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I'm not a social scientist, but the case I've seen him make, I find pretty dispositive. But maybe you disagree, and maybe it's different in America.
I've had this conversation with Eric many times, actually, who I love.
Yeah.
And he is very kind of analytically minded and quantitative, whereas I've read way too many books in psychoanalysis. And I kind of think that it's more that when the economy gives up and you're not progressing there, you have to kind of find and make new ground in the realm of the ideological.
Right.
So liberalism goes into a massive tailspin. I mean, I think, basically Western liberalism works so long as the graph keeps going up. But as soon as that's done, you have to find some other way to advance, because the one thing people can't ever stand is stagnation.
Do you think So is your take that there's a top-down, there's sort of top-down traffic there, that is to say, this is a kind of regime mechanism to keep people happy, despite, even though things are sort of looking shaky economically, or do you think it's a sort of grassroots sort of cry for investing life for the sort of meaning that is not available now that the GDP's line's going down?
It's both. I think the top-down aspect of it is that we have like kind of a kleptocracy now, which is basically that the high-class people can sell out their sons, daughters, and grandchildren by shipping things away and becoming more globalized and becoming these kind of world citizens. So it becomes a useful vehicle. It also distracts from the class aspect of it. So it's like focus on race and gender and don't pay attention to how much wealthier I'm getting. And then the bottom-up aspect is, as people kind of, as a result of actually that top-down action, as people lose the ability to see that, their children's lives will get better or that they're going to be able to progress meaningfully into the future, they have to find a new kind of mechanism that they can then progress on. If it's not going to be money, it's going to be ideology. And I think that works to a degree, but it spins out pretty quickly, which also is kind of what happened in the Weimar days, to be quite honest.
What it wouldn't explain, and this is why Eric is in favour of, generally speaking, of decoupling economics from culture when it comes to political opinion formation, is it wouldn't explain. Do you remember? Well, I was going to say, do you remember, as though I was around. I wasn't around, but I'm told that in the 80s, it was all the rage about Japan being the next big economy. Japan was booming and all the rest of it. Economically, Japan has been stagnating ever since, and it's not seeing these kinds of cultural skirmishes which we're seeing in the West, which would rather would throw into doubt the question whether this has to do with stagnation, economic stagnation, meaning that liberalism has to go into some kind of tailspin. Eric is much more partial, and I agree with him on this as well, to the notion that this has very important demographic conditions. I mean, like Black Lives Matter is not exactly thriving in Japan; it is thriving in England, and so all sorts of other highly ethnocentric movements that are almost bound to happen when you have extremely high, unprecedented rates of immigration without assimilation. People kind of revert back to their tribal categories, and it becomes impossible for us collectively to think in terms of what's Britain's national interest, when we have to think, as we always are thinking, in terms of, well, what's the black interest here, what's the Muslim interest here, what's the Asian interest here. Like, you get more of that going on, and Japan, being an incredibly homogenous country, doesn't have any of that. It wouldn't explain much of the gender stuff, and it wouldn't explain the obsession with sexuality and the obsession with non-binariness, but I think it would explain a lot of the racial identity politics.
I don't know. I mean, Camille Paglia makes this point, and Douglas Murray has echoed it in recent years, that when you kind of reach this like late stage, like sacking the capital era of the empire, people start really freaking out about the gender thing, because it's like, kind of all rules have gone out the window. Hey, first transsexual surgery was done in Weimar, Berlin, like 1928, I believe. I mean, that's when it was the Institute for Sexualschaffen or something like that. My German is abandoning me over the last year. That's when that all started. That's when it all came up, and then John Money, who popularized it in America, really, in Canada, he pulled all his stuff out of German academia, all of it.
Yeah, there is a recurring phenomenon. I mean, I think is it J.O. Urmson's, the Oxford scholar of the late 1930s, Sex and Culture, J.D. Unwin, I think it is, and also Carly Zimmerman, Family and Civilization. They make the point that it's a hallmark of late stage empire, certainly the case with Rome, certainly the case with the Ottoman Empire, that you have extreme forms of sexual decadence, gender confusion, etc., etc. Obviously, we're seeing this in a very different. It's now kind of married to a sort of technology that can reinforce the delusions over gender in a irreversible and barbaric way. But yeah, it's not something that is completely without historical precedent. So yeah, I mean, look, it's a difficult nut to crack. There are so many different factors operative, but I think, Harrison, your point that multiculturalism is a recipe for the collapse of social trust. It's a recipe for, as it were, a kind of balkanization of a nationhood. been involved in the National Conservative movement, National Conservatism movement for the last year quite intensely here in the UK. And the central point we're trying to make is that the spirit of nationalism, a commitment to nationhood, is not shouldn't be the strongest political kind of affection that we have. In fact, in my view, it's the weakest form of concrete attachment that one can have, beyond which things just get abstract and anemic. But that's got to be the sort of the organising horizon, and that has to be, that we have to have ways in which we can inculcate that sort of national spirit. Often they'll be pretty crude. Historically, Remembrance Sunday and the 2-minute silence has been, for as long as I can remember, at least until this year, has been one of those rare moments in our sort of secular national liturgy where there has been this sort of widespread agreement that we would come together as a nation, even though now as only a third of the country has no idea what we're doing with the poppies and the 2-minute silence, and so we're losing that sort of thing, and we're losing the battle primarily in the schools, not really in the universities. Actually, I think by the time the universities, there's another point.
Another point Eric
has made that really, and I think he's absolutely right, just from first-hand experience, but also from looking at the data. By 18, a person's outlook is pretty fully formed.
People come to universities armed with pre-existing prejudices.
And so really, the only person doing anything about this at the school level is Catherine Berbel-Singh. And I was so pleased that she came and spoke at the National Conservatism Conference, and she spoke at the ARC convention just a couple of weeks ago. And she is absolutely on this. She gets it, and she's calling out both the left and the right for not attending to the importance of inculcating a common culture.
Well, this is another thing, isn't it? I mean, this is really important. So the main things that I tend to locate it in, the rise of the Great Awakening, or whatever on earth you want to call it, is I would say that it. I've already mentioned the demographic conditioning factors, which I think are incredibly important, particularly when it comes to racial identity politics. But I also think one of the things that I think is really important as well is that conservatism is about nothing if it's not about the transmission of customs and habits and ideas and beliefs and patterns of behavior and all of these sorts of things. And when one generation abdicates that responsibility in favor of a kind of liberal individualism, everyone is free to decide their own values. Once everyone is reduced to, so to speak, an atomistic scrap of paper, and that becomes the ruling philosophy, all of a sudden those individual scraps of paper, children growing up, are very liable to get swept up in whatever grand ideological schemes happen to be the fashions of the hour and all this sort of thing. And so if you have an elite, a political elite, an educational elite, and all this, which is on the conservative side I'm talking about, which is so sort of obsessed with the economy and the GDP growing that they completely neglect the cultural battle, the territory, and they stop transmitting those basic values, and you don't give young people something to believe in strongly, you shouldn't be surprised when they're willing to buy any old nonsense that's being peddled by activists in schools and all the rest of it. And the only Conservative MP I've really noticed pay any attention to this problem is Miriam Cates. She's the only one who talks about the way in which our children are being relentlessly indoctrinated in schools. Other Conservatives, as far as I can tell, don't seem particularly willing to go anywhere near it. I mean, my brother, sorry to go on a little bit, but I think it's really illustrative of the point. My brother was born in 2009, so he's only ever gone to school with a Conservative government. And you wouldn't know that to look at his curriculum. No. I mean, he was learning Tudor history recently, and I asked him some questions about it. I said, do you know who John Calvin is? Do you know who Martin Luther is? Do you know? I was asking him about all the key figures of 16th century European history, and his whole lesson had been devoted to this sub-Saharan trumpeter called John Blank, who'd been in the court of Henry VIII. That's all he knew about 16th century British history, 16th century European history. And so it's very dispiriting to think Conservatives have had an influence. The Conservative Party has had an influence on what my brother might have been being taught in schools, and yet he hasn't been taught what he needs to be taught.
Well, yes and no. I mean, they've been in office, but have they been in power? Could they have been in power? I mean, what could they have done differently in 2010? I think, I'm not. I don't want to. I'm not an apologist for the Tory Party, but 2010 to 2015 was the parliamentary arithmetic was such that it was very difficult to make any major reforms to the Blair infrastructure. And I think also in that period, I remember, nobody was really too worried about the Equality Act. It was just Equality Act 2010 was just updating the Equality Act 2006. And then there was a sort of sense of, there was still that kind of slight lingering end of history vibe. There was the worries were economic. The apocalypse was a financial one.
Yeah.
It was all the bankers' fault. It was the 1%. It was the elite. There wasn't this sense of, we didn't see it coming. We didn't see 2012 coming, 2013, 2014. I only started really seeing it happening on the ground in Oxford, late 2014. It was starting to break a bit in 2013. 2015, you then have this surprise victory for Cameron, then this forced into calling the Brexit referendum, then Brexit takes over and dominates everything. 2016, chaos. 2017 election, chaos, and then the battle. And so you've got this sort of constant, I understand why nothing has been done anywhere really in the last 13 years. I mean, I don't know what could have been done differently. We know, and I know this from various battles on the academic freedom front, where we actually have had serious success. I mean, it's okay, maybe in the grand scheme of things a relatively small success, but it is the passing of the Freedom of Speech Higher Education Act 2023. It was a clear manifesto commitment in 2019 that persisted across the last three prime ministers. And has been delivered, and it did get done. And I think there are lessons we can learn from how we managed to get it done. But reform of secondary education and curricular content. I mean, I think there are simple ways. I think there are simple fixes. For example, I mean, it is already the law under the 1996 Education Act, section 405, 406, I think, that teachers are not allowed to present plainly partisan curricular content without explaining that it is partisan and without presenting the other side. I think part of the problem is that when that was passed in the dying days of the Tory government, major government in 1996, nobody really, there was no statutory definition as to quite what political partisanship involved. Now the Department for Education has done its best, well, maybe not its best, but it's provided guidance to explain that support for BLM or the latest sort of rainbow craze is plainly, is ideologically freighted.
Because they tend to hide behind the idea that it's only political if it's party political.
Precisely. That's the way that...
Yeah.
Well, and I think a lot of them genuinely believe, I mean, I think if you just took a straw poll of the National Union of Teachers, it would not cross their mind
that it would be wrong.
That going on a Pride March is an ideological act, is an expression of an ideological...
I've said on this programme before that they think that going on a Pride March or going on a BLM rally is the equivalent of being against kicking kittens in the face.
Absolutely
so
right.
if you think that, then there's nothing necessarily political about that, because it's so they shroud it in such moralising terms.
Absolutely right, and this is a line I've trotted out before. But one of the problems with groupthink is that wrong think becomes evil think. That once a sort of minority position once you reach a certain tipping point, a certain sort of point in the preference cascade, it becomes very, very easy to simply demonize the minority view as being simply immoral, and so that the dominant view is simply morally irrefutable, and therefore not even sort of touching the domain of politics. And so that act has been completely toothless. Just as, in fact, I mean, we got this Freedom of Speech Higher Education Act through, but in fact, academic freedom has been on the statute books, has been pretty well protected since 1986, since the big battles that Thatcher fought with the universities in the 1980s. It just, it needed a little bit of updating. This new act puts positive duties on the universities to promote academic freedom more than they promote other values. And it creates a directorate, which is very important, and gives that directorate significant executive and quasi-judicial powers. But a lot of these laws, it's not been a problem. It's not been a question of the Conservatives failing because they haven't pushed the right laws through. It's basically a sort of blob culture problem, an elite culture problem.
It's an anarcho-tyranny problem.
Right.
Where it's that, I mean, people, I hear in Britain, and maybe this is a cultural thing a lot, people will say things like, nothing can be done. It's like, no, nothing will be done. That's very different than nothing can be done. There's very little that the UK could not do as like a major first world power within its own borders or abroad if the political will was there.
Yeah.
And I think, I think you're seeing in America now, and actually some other countries in Europe as well, you're seeing kind of a counter elite of people who are recognizing this kind of a narco-tyranny dynamic. The rules are not fair, that the battle of the marketplace of ideas is kind of rigged against them. There's a finger on the scales. I'm thinking of people like Chris Rufo, and who are fighting back in like a very tangible, serious, dare I say, Machiavellian sort of way, and it's been highly effective. And I think there's enough people with brains to do it, and the power and even the money in the UK to do something like that, but it hasn't really crystallized or galvanized yet.
Well, I think you're right, and you're right we're right to think of the problem as an elite problem, and we're right to start thinking about the solution as a solution that only a counter elite can bring about. So to that extent, I'm not a populist. I appreciate many populists, and I think that any counter elite should seek to harness and express and bring about the will of the people where it is not being.
You saw where I was going with this, yeah.
Right.
One question I really want you to answer there for us, though, is that you're an academic, you're deep in these circles. How do you go about identifying people who would be a good member of that new counter elite? What do you look for?
Well, I don't go looking actively for them. Most come to me. Many students write to me. Many people from outside the university write to me, and I get to know them. We have a lunch at our home, a Sunday salon every Sunday in Cambridge, and any student who wants to come can come, whatever their ideological background or politics. And a lot of them have not been away from home for long periods before, and I remember at university myself, and in fact at boarding school myself, going to other family homes during when one was at school, and so we provide that sort of form a kind of community, a sort of home from home, and so I get to meet a lot of wonderful, brilliant people. And I think talent's pretty easy to spot. I mean, there's just a lot of it if you're in a place like Cambridge. It's sort of selecting, on the whole, it's selecting the best and brightest of each generation, especially at the graduate level, where there you've got really, at the undergraduate level, you're getting the best and brightest of Britain. At the graduate level, Cambridge is regularly topping the world university charts. You're getting some of the best brains on the planet passing through. So, really, I mean, I think at that level, sort of early 20s, mid 20s, people sort of are still kind of learning the ropes. But I will try and find roles for them if we're putting together a big conference or convention. I put on lots of events, involved in various little guerrilla projects, and I don't have the time to invest in all of them. But I will try and mentor them where I can, or at least, or what I've taken to doing more often is to identifying skilled mentors, impressive young lads, impressive young ladies who would, take a young person under their wing and sort of nurture them and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain sort of, I think there needs to be a certain openness at the lower levels, an openness to having a pretty messy coalition. This sort of counter elite that is beginning to emerge, actually, in ordinary times would be tearing strips off each other on all kinds of different issues. And I know I still find it odd, sitting at the, breaking bread with people with wildly different corners of the ideological spectrum, but where we're actually supporting each other because we recognise that there is a more kind of, bigger civilizational conflict to be fought. And Evan, you mentioned Rufo's successes. He is really, I mean, he's an exemplar in many ways. But I think we're securing some victories here in the UK which are not being secured in the US. I mentioned the victories on academic freedom, the academic freedom front. There's obviously the turnaround, the sort of Turf Island turnaround. Gender critical feminists here in the UK have fought an extraordinary battle. Maybe a dozen, 2 dozen of them at most.
Yes.
So there are. I mean, I think, and those are grassroots movements. Or think of the Free Speech Union, work that Toby Young has been doing. You look across the West and you think, there's Rufo as a one-man band, and there may be other certain similar things happening, American Moment and other sort of, I think NatCon in the US certainly. But actually, I think we've got a lot to be proud of.
Oh, yeah.
But we've got to catalyse it. We've got to give it new energy, and we've got to look for new kind of pieces of infrastructure and sort of pop-up movements like the FSU or Sex Matters or the various academic freedom initiatives. The various, and I think we need to be open to that, and I think it's a fundamentally conservative way of these are little platoons. These are Burkean platoons, but probably not quite what Burke had in mind.
Not what he meant at all.
Not what he meant at all. But and yet it is, in the sense that these are not kind of top-down solutions. These are solutions that are kind of the expression of the body politic. They're expressions of civil society. They're just slightly odd. They're not the kind of established institutions. They're not kind of guilds.
They're not customary.
Yeah. Well, they are and they're not. I mean, in a way, they are reactions to attacks on the customary.
Yeah.
And so they are sort of, yes, they're ad hoc.
They build themselves on the template of the customary, but they're not themselves customary.
That's right.
That might be a way to put it.
And I think what's missing in all of this is a guiding grand récit, what Lyotard wanted to reject, a guiding grand narrative, a story. And this is the contentious point. But I mean, you were right to say earlier, Harrison, that it's a sort of emblematically conservative to be focused on the traditional and customs and conventions and so on. And I'd say yes, but one needs to be more than it needs to be more than simply conserving tradition for the sake of it.
It needs to be more than mere ancestor worship. That you need to have. I agree with you. You need to have an understanding of what is good that gave those things the life which they should have preserved.
Absolutely, and I don't want to go down a religious rabbit hole now, but I do. I think it's very, very. It's going to be more and more important for us, for those of us who want to see genuine, lasting, positive cultural change that's not simply reactionary, to be able to defend traditions and conventions and customs ultimately by reference to justifying them as expressions of some, albeit contingent, but truth-tracking pursuit of the beautiful and the good and reality itself. Now, I give a Christian framing to those capital T transcendentals. Others, it's compatible with other ways of construing it. You might be kind of a Platonist, you might be even a Stoic, I suppose. But in the end, you're going to have to I think we're going to have to start articulating a defence in terms of some fixed objective way that the world is.
A universal idiom that gives sense to all of these particular things.
Yes, an idiom that is anchored in the real,
yes,
and the good and the true.
What did you make of Ion's latest essay where, another new atheist has bit the dust here, and she's come out as maybe not a believer in, like God is real, resurrection actually happened, but in like being a cultural Christian, you might want to call it.
Yeah, there was a debate about this a year or two ago, wasn't there? About many Christians will be sniffy about cultural Christianity, and I share that concern. That I've met so many friends who say, well, I'm a flying buttress on the church.
That's what Churchill said about it.
So Churchill said about it. Roger Scruton is like that. Douglas Murray, Tom Holland is.
I support the church from outside.
And that's fine. But if everyone is just supporting a structure from without,
no one's inside it.
The thing is going to collapse. Nevertheless, I'm grateful that they're there. And in fact, in many ways, tactically, they play an incredibly important role because they're not seen as party pre. I think this is the great the great power of Jordan Peterson, that he's always, he's sort of doing this sort of delicate tango, this dance in the borderlands between belief and unbelief.
Yeah.
And he's moved the whole kind of sterile new atheist, sort of angry new atheist rhetoric on so much further forward. And actually, it was very moving to be sitting in that room and listening to Ayan speak, express herself, and in many ways, I think that article was really a crystallization of her panel remarks at the art conference. And yes, at one level, it's a sort of reflexive reaching out for a kind of the stability and the old order of Christendom. And yet, at the same time, there was something profoundly, almost sort of, viscerally metaphysical about the remarks, because they were prefaced with the most sort of clear-eyed description of the barbarities of October the 7th. That is to say, there's almost a sort of, this is something metaphysical about the horror that was witnessed on that day, and the reaction and horrors that reminded her of her upbringing. And she has clearly come to see that secular accounts or evolutionary accounts, Darwinian, Dawkinsian accounts of evil. What is it that Dawkins says in Unweaving the Rainbow in 1996? At the bottom of the universe, there is neither good nor evil. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. On that new atheist paradigm, giving a sort of the proper kind of phenomenology of the moral horror of events like October the 7th, it's just difficult for us to cope with a purely evolutionary just so story. And so I don't know. I know there's a lot of cynicism. There's been some cynicism in the response to Ayan's piece for Unheard, which was a couple of days ago now. But I think we'll look back on it as a quite a significant moment, and I wouldn't be surprised. As a friend of mine texted me this just this morning, I think. You're saying people are losing their minds over Ayan sort of becoming just a cultural Christian, but that I wouldn't be at all surprised that actually there has been some Damascene moment for her, but that it's just
you can't express it like that.
It's very difficult to express something that personal, and to do it so quickly and suddenly. And so, I mean, my goodness, it's the more of that the more that phenomenon emerges, the better, as far as I'm concerned. If only it were the case, that said, that there was a church, a national church, that was set up to welcome and embrace these people for whom whose faith is coming alive. And I've lost count of the number of friends I've spoken to, particularly over COVID, actually, to us 2-3 years, who've for one reason or another, often through very, very different routes, have come back to or have stumbled towards faith and have wanted to read about it. I'm do philosophy of religion, so I get these emails the whole time, and I try and answer them as fully as I can every time. So I have these sort of various reading lists for people at sort of different levels. But that there's been a massive uptick in that, and some sort of quite influential people. The one thing I can't do, when they ask, they say, well, where should I go to church? I don't know what to do. Yeah. I look at Wobbly Welby and I look at Francis going mad in Rome, and I just don't know what to do. And I don't have an answer for them.
The digital Anabaptists, perhaps.
Well, yeah, that's what I think. We need to start building the catacombs, and Christians certainly need to get out of, I think, of the Constantinian mode of thinking about Christianity. It's particularly if you're an Anglican, you're just part of this weird leftist theocracy that is the Church of England, and it's difficult to know what to do, but it's difficult to realise that it's over. The Church of England is to all intents and purposes, at least it seems to be. That seems to be the direction of travel in terms of raw numbers, and so it's difficult for Christians to start to think of themselves as being better off in something like a catechism, even if it's a digital catechism. And here we get to sort of Rodriguez Benedict option, and which I fully support, and I don't accept the misreadings and criticisms that book's attracted, to the effect that it's just it's a manifesto for withdrawal and retreat.
An escapism.
It's not that at all. I think we need to be both. I mean, I think Rod's work has been, is incredibly useful as sort of, they've got great sort of handbook manuals for how Christians should go about things. But I don't think there's a massive difference really for, secular refugees from the revolution. They too need to be thinking about, in similar ways. I think that there's an awful lot going on. There's an incredibly exciting moment to be alive, exciting moment to be involved in all these different battles. Think how boring it would have been if we'd been, if this was the late 1980s or 90s. I mean, I love the 90s. I grew up in the 90s, teenager in the 90s, but nobody ever talked about, nobody cared about anything really back then.
Yes. Well, I don't know that. So I can't know for sure because I was only born in the late 90s. Maybe I would have enjoed it. But I want to come back briefly just before we finish up on something that you said earlier, which struck me as interesting. And I know you don't. You say you're not an apologist for the Conservative Party and all the rest of it. I'm not saying that you are, but you seem to be saying that explaining their failures in terms of forces over which they had minimal control. And and I suppose that's my point in a way, that they didn't regard themselves as custodians, as trustees of anything. Like and in a weird way, the most far-sighted governments at the moment that we've had in recent history have been the left-wing Labour ones, because they understand that it's not just enough to. I mean, the New Labour understood this extremely well. You want to make constitutional changes. You want to make cultural changes, because these things are for keeps. You're thinking about, like in the 1997 Labour manifesto, I think they said something as audacious as, for the next century, New Labour wants to be the political arm of the British people. Like thinking in terms of this is going to be a Labour century. The 20th century was a Tory century. This is going to be a Labour century. In many ways, the Labour Party thinks much more farsightedly about these things, and the Conservatives, because they're just focused on the weekly news flare-ups, or just because they're focused on the GDP going up this year, they don't see themselves as custodians over anything. They've lost that mentality, and in many other cases as well, they want to fight. They want to engage the left in its own terms. I tear my hair. Not that I have anything against there being ethnic minority ministers or women prime ministers, but I tear my hair out when they start saying things like, "We've got a more diverse cabinet than you do, Labour. Ever did, Labour. We've had 3 female prime ministers. You haven't had any." That sort of thing.
Did David Cameron write an essay saying that when he came into number 10, it was too white and male? I'm pretty sure he did.
It's very possible. Yeah. But this is the point. Like, you constantly, if you're winning on the left's own terms, then you're, in a larger sense, you're losing monumentally. And the Conservatives, they seem completely incapable of appreciating the task that is before them. And I want. This is the question I want to put to you: is it possible to cure them of that as a political organism without having them effectively wiped out in 2024 and plunging them into an identity crisis so profound that they're forced to grapple with these questions in a way that they clearly haven't been doing for 13 years, whether you think there are contingent reasons for that or not?
Well, lots of things one could say on that. I mean, I think, the party as it stands is toast. I mean, until recently, I thought there may be the possibility of a hung parliament, but I think it's looking. And look, 10 months is a long time in politics, assuming a sort of September-October election, 2024. But I think we're looking at. I think a 1997 level wipeout is not unlikely, and I think that will catalyse the identity crisis that you describe. Now, it's not clear to me what the composition of the rump will be.
Yes, that's important.
Which will be very important. My understanding is, from people in the know, that the expectation is that it'll be a fairly proportionate reduction, so that you'll see roughly comparable constellation of factions in terms of roughly the same proportions. In which case, it's going to be. Well,
it's going to be harder.
Who knows? It could be, a Penny Mordaunt, Suella Braverman, or Penny Mordaunt, Kemi Badenoch showdown. Who knows what would happen at the grassroots? But what the ideal would be for the Tory right to settle on a figure as leader, and for there to put in place the best policy and personnel operation of any opposition in living memory from 2024 to 2029. And that means organisation on a level that we've not seen before. I think the support is there. I think the public support is there. I think the ideas are there. The emerging ecosystem fostering a kind of counter-elite is there. There's actually a lot of the intellectual energy is on the right. It's not on the left, or it's in this sort of slightly murky, messy post-liberal landscape, which in effect I think is there are sort of left-leaning elements in it, particularly on economics. But I think broadly speaking, the energy of the sort of kind of counter-elite is very much on the right. So I think there will be everything to play for in 2028, 2029. Labour is going to be inheriting a recession. The ongoing consequences of mass unchecked migration without any idea at all of how to assimilate. And it's going to be doubling down on all of the divisive woke policies that are going to continue to corrode public trust in the common good. So, it's going to be a dark decade, I think. But I don't see any alternative than trying to recover the heart of the Tory party and to return it to its roots and to invest it with energy, with new people, with young people. And with a very, very clear policy agenda, not just a policy agenda, but drafted bills that are ready
to go,
that are oven ready.
Yes.
In 2029, and we don't discuss. They're clear manifesto commitments, and then bang, get rid of the public sector equality duty on arrival.
Yes.
We toughen up the Education Act,
which the Conservatives expanded, by the way, in 2017. It's worth mentioning as a detail.
I think one thing too is that the Tory party needs to get, and the Americans are already on this with their people like Vivek or some of the new candidates coming up.
Right.
They need to get way more confident in their use of propaganda.
Yeah.
Call it marketing if that makes you feel better, but that's what it is. I'm using it in the actual original use of the word.
Propagate your message.
No, but be unapologetic and get your message out. And it's like they're announcing whatever, people coming into the cabinet now. They look like baseball trading cards. It's terrible. It's so bad.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a note of caution there, namely that it's easy to get sucked into a kind of social media game, and I think one of the problems with the DeSantis campaign at the moment is that it's relied a little bit too much on trendy, clever. I mean, they fight an amazing meme war, but is victory in the meme war actually the defeat in terms of the opportunity costs of not actually attending to the people who've never had no idea what Twitter is, the actual voters. Are meme wars just, as it were, consolidating your
existing support,
your digital base, and that basically unusually committed followers on social media. And so, but no, I agree, Evan, you're absolutely right. The messaging needs to change, and we've got to sort of get rid of the kind of cuddly, softly. We're Labour, but with a bit more. We've got Labour's heart, but with a bit more brain, kind of thing. I mean, there's got to be something.
Yes.
There's something radical. As Thatcher successfully presented in '79, with a lot of people behind her. There were a lot of ideas going around. She relied and outsourced a lot of her thinking to people like Keith Joseph and others.
Yes.
And as Blair did between 1994 and 1997, that's what we need to be thinking about in the 24 to 29 period in the second half of the decade.
And then maybe 29 can be our annus mirabilis. James, it's been such a pleasure having you on Deprogrammed. Thank you so much for coming on. Evan, thanks as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.